In 2008, a family of four vanished without a trace just 3 months after moving into a Victorian mansion in the quiet town of Millbrook, Connecticut, leaving behind only their belongings and a mystery that would haunt the community for years. But 15 years later, a contractor renovating the abandoned property would discover something hidden behind the walls that would change everything investigators thought they knew about the Wells family disappearance. Alex Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stood in the dusty foyer of the Blackwood mansion, the late morning sun filtering through grimy windows and casting long shadows across the warped hardwood floors. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, a testament to the 15 years of neglect that had followed the mysterious disappearance of its last inhabitants. He had taken on this renovation project reluctantly. The house had a reputation in Millbrook, one that made most contractors politely decline when the new owners approached them for estimates. But Alex needed the work, and the pay was too good to refuse, even if it meant spending his days in a place where an entire family had simply vanished into thin air. The Wells family had moved into the mansion in September of 2008. Robert Wells, a software engineer from Boston, had inherited the property from a distant relative and saw it as an opportunity for a fresh start with his wife Catherine and their two children, 12-year-old Emma and 8-year-old Jake. The Victorian house, built in 1887, sat on 3 acres of overgrown land at the end of Maple Street, its Gothic Revival architecture both imposing and beautiful. For 3 months, neighbors had seen the family going about their daily routines. Catherine had been spotted at the local grocery store, the children had enrolled in Millbrook Elementary, and Robert had been working remotely from his home office. To all appearances, they were settling into small-town life with the enthusiasm of city dwellers discovering the charm of rural Connecticut. Then, on December 15, 2008, they were gone. The first sign something was wrong came when Jake failed to show up for school. His teacher, Mrs. Henderson, called the house repeatedly but got no answer. When the school's concern escalated to the local police, Officer Martinez was dispatched to conduct a welfare check. What he found defied explanation. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house looked lived in but abandoned. Breakfast dishes sat on the kitchen table, half-eaten and growing cold. Catherine's purse lay open on the counter, her wallet and keys still inside. Upstairs, Emma's homework was spread across her desk, a math assignment half completed in her careful handwriting. Jake's bed was unmade, his favorite stuffed elephant sitting on the pillow where he'd apparently left it the night before. But the family was nowhere to be found. Their car, a blue Honda Accord, remained in the driveway. Robert's laptop was still open in his study, logged into his work email with several unread messages from concerned colleagues. Catherine's medication for high blood pressure sat on the bathroom counter, indicating she hadn't taken her morning dose. Most disturbing of all, the family's winter coats hung in the hall closet, even though December in Connecticut demanded warm clothing for anyone venturing outside. The initial investigation was thorough, but yielded no concrete leads. Detective Lisa Chen, then a junior investigator with the state police, had been assigned to assist the local department with what appeared to be a complex missing persons case. She interviewed neighbors, school officials, and Robert's work colleagues, but no one could provide any insight into why the Wells family might have left so suddenly, or where they might have gone. Security cameras were rare in Millbrook in 2008, and the mansion's remote location meant there were no witnesses to whatever had happened during the night of December 14th or the early hours of December 15th. The investigation eventually went cold, though Detective Chen never forgot the case that had puzzled her so deeply early in her career. Now, 15 years later, Alex Thompson was gutting the mansion's interior under the direction of new owners who had purchased the property at a significant discount. Reputation be damned. The house had been sealed by police for nearly 2 years following the disappearance, then had sat empty, slowly deteriorating as legal battles over the estate played out in probate court. As Alex worked his way through the first floor, removing outdated fixtures, and preparing to update the electrical system, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was disturbing something that had been deliberately left untouched. Every room told a story of interrupted lives, from the children's toys still scattered in the living room to the family photos that remained hanging on the walls, their smiling faces now seeming almost ghostly in the dim light. It was while examining the wall between the dining room and the kitchen that Alex first noticed something unusual. The wallpaper pattern didn't quite align, and when he pressed against the surface, he detected a subtle difference in the way the wall felt. Years of construction experience had taught him to recognize when something wasn't quite right with a structure, and this wall was definitely hiding something. As he prepared to investigate further, Alex couldn't have imagined that his discovery would finally provide answers to a mystery that had haunted Millbrook for over a decade. Answers that would prove the Wells family's disappearance was far more sinister than anyone had ever suspected. The Blackwood mansion had never been meant for a family like the Wells. Built in 1887 by textile magnate Harrison Blackwood, the imposing Victorian structure had been designed as a testament to wealth and status, its Gothic Revival towers and ornate gingerbread trim proclaiming the owner's prominence in an era when Millbrook was a thriving mill town rather than the sleepy suburban community it had become by 2008. Eleanor Hartwell remembered when the Blackwoods still lived there. At 87, she was one of the few residents old enough to recall the mansion's glory days, when carriages would line the circular drive for elaborate dinner parties, and the sound of laughter would drift across the manicured gardens. She had been just a girl then, living with her parents in the modest house next door, watching through her bedroom window as elegant ladies in bustled dresses promenaded across the mansion's wraparound porch. But the Blackwood fortune hadn't lasted. The textile mills that had built the family's wealth began closing in the 1920s, and by the time Eleanor was a young woman, the mansion had already begun its slow decline. Harrison's son, William, had struggled to maintain the property through the Depression, eventually selling off pieces of the original estate just to pay taxes. When William died childless in 1964, the mansion passed to distant relatives who had little interest in maintaining a deteriorating Victorian relic in a town they'd never visited. For the next 4 decades, the Blackwood mansion had changed hands, repeatedly. Each new owner arrived with grand plans for restoration, only to discover that the house seemed to resist their efforts. Contractors would quit unexpectedly, citing equipment malfunctions and unexplained accidents. Families would move in with enthusiasm, but rarely stayed longer than a year, invariably claiming the house felt uncomfortable, wrong somehow. Eleanor had watched this pattern repeat itself from her kitchen window for decades, but she had never spoken about what she sometimes saw in the mansion's windows after dark. In a town like Millbrook, where everyone knew everyone else's business, there were some observations that were better kept to oneself. The Wells family had been different, though. When Robert and Catherine arrived in September of 2008, they had approached Eleanor immediately, introducing themselves and their children with the kind of genuine warmth she rarely encountered anymore. Robert had been particularly interested in the mansion's history, asking detailed questions about the Blackwood family and the property's previous owners. "My great-uncle mentioned this place in his letters," Robert had told Eleanor during one of their conversations over the fence that separated their properties. "He inherited it from someone on my grandmother's side, but the genealogy gets complicated. I'm hoping to piece together the family connection while we're here." Catherine had been equally charming, offering to help Eleanor with her garden and immediately enrolling Emma and Jake in local activities. The children had been polite and well-behaved, the kind of neighbors any elderly woman would appreciate having next door. Emma, in particular, had reminded Eleanor of herself at that age, curious and intelligent, always asking questions about the mansion's history and the families who had lived there. For 3 months, Eleanor had allowed herself to believe that the Wells might be the family to finally bring life back to the Blackwood mansion. She had watched Catherine hanging laundry in the backyard and seen Robert working in his study, the warm glow of his desk lamp visible through the window late into the evening. The children's voices had echoed across the yard as they played, their laughter a sound the property hadn't heard in years. Then came December 15th. Eleanor had been up early that morning, as was her habit, making coffee and watching the sunrise through her kitchen window. She had noticed that the mansion seemed unusually quiet, no signs of the morning routine she had grown accustomed to observing. By mid-morning, when she still hadn't seen any movement, a nagging worry had begun to form in the back of her mind. It was the mailman who had first voiced concern. "Haven't seen the Wells family in a couple days," he had mentioned to Eleanor when she met him at her mailbox. "Their box is getting pretty full." Eleanor had walked to the fence that afternoon, calling out to see if anyone was home. When no one answered, she had felt a familiar chill, the same sensation she had experienced with other families who had lived in the mansion over the years. But this time felt different. This time felt final. The police had arrived that evening, their patrol cars casting red and blue shadows across both properties as they conducted their investigation. Eleanor had watched from her window as officers moved through the mansion with flashlights, documenting what they found and trying to make sense of a scene that defied logical explanation. In the 15 years since that night, Eleanor had never spoken publicly about what she believed had happened to the Wells family. But as she watched Alex Thompson's truck parked in the mansion's driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that some secrets were about to surface, whether the world was ready for them or not. Alex Thompson had always trusted his instincts when it came to construction work. 23 years in the business had taught him to recognize when something wasn't right with a structure, and the wall between the dining room and kitchen was definitely wrong. The wallpaper, a faded burgundy damask pattern, didn't align properly along one section, creating a subtle but noticeable discontinuity that suggested the wall had been modified after the original construction. He pressed his palms against the surface, feeling for variations in density and support. Most of the wall felt solid, backed by the sturdy timber framing typical of Victorian-era construction. But there was a section, roughly 4 feet wide and extending from floor to ceiling, that gave slightly under pressure and produced a hollow sound when tapped. Setting down his tools, Alex stepped back to examine the wall more carefully. The mansion's original blueprints, which he had obtained from the town hall, showed no indication of any structural modifications in this area. According to the 1887 plans, the wall should have been solid throughout, supporting the second floor, bedroom directly above. The more he studied the anomaly, the more convinced he became that someone had deliberately created a hidden space. The wallpaper had been carefully reapplied to disguise the modification, but time and settling had revealed the deception. Whoever had done this work had possessed considerable skill, but they hadn't accounted for the natural movement of an old house over decades. Alex retrieved his reciprocating saw from his truck, along with a dust mask and safety goggles. If there was indeed a hidden space behind this wall, he needed to access it carefully. The new owners had given him carte blanche to modify the interior as needed for the renovation, but discovering a concealed room would definitely require their immediate attention. He began cutting a small inspection hole, just large enough to peer inside with a flashlight. The saw blade encountered resistance after penetrating the wallpaper and plaster, hitting what felt like wooden planking. This confirmed his suspicion that someone had created a false wall, installing new lumber to conceal whatever lay behind it. The smell hit him as soon as he broke through the final layer of wood. It wasn't the musty odor of old house settling, or the damp scent of minor water damage. This was something else entirely, something that made his stomach clench and his pulse quicken. He had encountered similar odors before, during a renovation project where they had discovered a family of raccoons that had died in the walls. But this smell was different, more complex, more disturbing. Alex enlarged the hole carefully, removing additional sections of the false wall until he had created an opening large enough to shine his flashlight inside. What he saw in the beam of light made him stumble backward, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his cell phone. The concealed space was larger than he had expected, extending back nearly 6 feet into what should have been the kitchen's interior wall. But it wasn't empty. Personal belongings were stacked carefully throughout the space, as if someone had methodically hidden them away. He could see children's clothing, books, family photographs, and what appeared to be important documents stored in plastic containers. The far end of the hidden room, barely visible in the flashlight's beam, was something that made Alex's blood run cold. A child's backpack, pink with butterfly patches, sat next to a smaller blue backpack decorated with cartoon characters. Both appeared to have been placed there deliberately, positioned as if their owners might return for them at any moment. Alex's hands trembled as he dialed Detective Lisa Chen's number, which he had found in an old newspaper article about the Wells family disappearance. He had researched the case before accepting the renovation job, wanting to understand what he might be getting himself into. "Detective Chen," came the professional voice on the other end of the line. "Detective, this is Alex Thompson. I'm the contractor working on the Blackwood Mansion renovation." His voice was barely steady. "I think you need to get down here immediately. I found something behind the walls." There was a pause before Detective Chen responded, and Alex could hear the change in her tone. After 15 years, the Wells case was about to be reopened. "Don't touch anything else, Mr. Thompson. I'm on my way." As Alex waited for the detective to arrive, he couldn't bring himself to look into the hidden space again. Whatever had happened to the Wells family, the answers were concealed behind that wall, waiting to finally emerge after 15 years of silence. Detective Lisa Chen arrived at the Blackwood Mansion 43 minutes after Alex Thompson's call, her unmarked sedan kicking up gravel as she pulled into the circular driveway. The years had changed her from the junior investigator who had first worked the Wells case, but the sight of the mansion brought back every detail of that December morning 15 years ago when she had walked through these same rooms, searching for answers that had remained maddeningly elusive. Now a senior detective with the Connecticut State Police Major Crime Unit, Chen had worked hundreds of cases since 2008, but the Wells family disappearance had never left her thoughts completely. It was the kind of case that haunted experienced investigators, the one that made you question everything you thought you knew about how people simply vanish without a trace. Alex met her at the front door, his face pale and his hands still visibly shaking. "Detective Chen, thank you for coming so quickly. I wasn't sure who else to call." "You did the right thing," Chen assured him, pulling on latex gloves as she followed him through the foyer. The mansion looked exactly as she remembered it, though 15 years of abandonment had taken their toll. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through grimy windows, and the floorboards creaked with each step, as if the house itself was protesting this intrusion into its long-held secrets. "I've been careful not to disturb anything beyond the initial opening," Alex explained as they approached the dining room. "But, Detective, what I found in there, it's going to change everything about this case." Chen nodded, her training taking over, as she prepared to examine what might be the most significant development in a case that had defined the early years of her career. "Walk me through exactly what happened, from the beginning." Alex described his discovery methodically, explaining how he had noticed the irregularity in the wall pattern and the hollow sound when tapped. He showed her the reciprocating saw he had used and the small pile of wallpaper and plaster debris from his initial cut. "The smell hit me first," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "It's not like anything I've encountered in construction work. And then when I saw what was inside..." Chen approached the opening Alex had created, pulling a high-powered LED flashlight from her investigation kit. The beam cut through the darkness of the concealed space, illuminating the carefully arranged belongings that Alex had discovered. Her breath caught as she recognized items that matched the descriptions from the original missing persons report. The children's backpacks were exactly as Alex had described them. Emma's pink bag with butterfly patches was positioned next to Jake's blue backpack decorated with characters from a popular cartoon show. Both were clean and appeared to have been placed there with care, not thrown hastily during some kind of emergency. Chen directed her flashlight deeper into the space, revealing additional items that sent chills down her spine. Family photographs were stacked neatly in protective plastic sleeves, showing the Wells family during happier times. Birthday parties, vacation trips, school events, all the normal documentation of a family's life together. But it was the presence of important documents that truly disturbed her. She could see what appeared to be birth certificates, social security cards, and passports, all sealed in waterproof containers, as if someone had been preparing for a long absence or wanted to preserve them indefinitely. "Alex, I need you to step back from this area," Chen said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used at crime scenes. "This is now an active investigation site. I'm calling in the crime scene unit and the medical examiner's office." As she pulled out her radio to contact headquarters, Chen's mind was already racing through the implications of what they had found. The careful organization of the belongings suggested premeditation, not a sudden departure or abduction. Someone had taken considerable time to gather these items and conceal them behind a skillfully constructed false wall. But who? And why? The Wells family had seemed genuinely happy in Millbrook during their brief time here. The original investigation had uncovered no evidence of financial problems, marital difficulties, or any other factors that might explain a voluntary disappearance. Robert's work colleagues had described him as dedicated and reliable, while Catherine had been actively involved in community activities and the children's school. Chen examined the opening more carefully, noting the quality of the construction. Work required to create such a convincing false wall. This wasn't amateur hour. Whoever had done this possessed considerable carpentry skills and had access to materials that matched the mansion's original construction. "Detective," Alex said quietly from behind her, "there's something else you should know. The new owners mentioned that they found a set of keys hidden in the kitchen pantry when they first inspected the property. They thought it was just old house keys, but now I'm wondering if one of them might open something in that hidden space." Chen turned to face him, her expression grim. After 15 years of dead ends and unanswered questions, the Wells case was about to reveal its secrets. But as she looked into the concealed room, she couldn't shake the feeling that what they were about to discover would be far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The crime scene unit arrived within the hour, transforming the quiet mansion into a hub of investigative activity. Yellow tape cordoned off the dining room while technicians set up portable lighting to illuminate the hidden space. Detective Chen watched as photographer Maria Santos documented every angle of the discovery, her camera flash creating stark shadows against the concealed room's contents. Dr. James Reeves, the state medical examiner, knelt beside the opening with a portable air quality monitor, testing for any biological hazards before allowing his team to proceed. "The preliminary readings show elevated levels of organic decomposition," he reported. To Chen, his voice muffled by the protective mask he wore. "But it's not consistent with human remains, more likely rodent activity or organic materials breaking down over time." Chen felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that they weren't dealing with bodies, but frustration that the mystery was becoming more complex rather than clearer. She had hoped the hidden space might provide definitive answers about the Wells family's fate, but instead, it was raising new questions. Alex Thompson waited in the mansion's living room, having been asked to remain available for additional questions. Through the doorway, he could see the methodical work of the investigation team as they carefully removed items from the concealed space and cataloged each piece of evidence. Detective Chen called Officer Martinez, the same man who had conducted the original welfare check 15 years ago and was now nearing retirement. "You need to see this." Chen joined Martinez at a folding table where evidence was being processed. He held up a leather journal, its cover worn but well preserved. "Found this wrapped in plastic at the back of the space. Looks like someone's diary or notebook." Chen opened the journal carefully, recognizing Catherine Wells's handwriting from samples in the original case file. The entries began in September 2008, shortly after the family had moved into the mansion. The early pages were filled with typical observations about settling into a new home and community. September 15th. Emma loves her new school. Mrs. Peterson seems like a wonderful teacher. Jake is still adjusting but made a friend at recess today. September 22nd. Robert found some interesting documents in the study. Apparently his great-uncle left more than just the house. There's a whole collection of papers about the property's history. But as Chen turned the pages, the tone of Catherine's entries began to change. By October, there were mentions of strange noises at night and unexplained cold spots throughout the house. The family's initial enthusiasm for their new home was gradually being replaced by unease. October 8th. Heard footsteps in the attic again last night. Robert says it's just the house settling, but I've lived in old houses before. This is different. October 15th. Emma asked why there are scratching sounds in the walls of her bedroom. I told her it was probably mice, but the exterminator found no evidence of any pest activity. The entries became more frequent and increasingly disturbed as November progressed. Catherine wrote about doors that opened by themselves, furniture that moved during the night, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Most troubling were her concerns about the children's behavior. November 3rd. Jake has been talking to someone in his room at night. When I ask who, he says, "The lady in the wall," getting worried about his imagination running wild in this place. November 18th. Found Emma sleepwalking again. Third time this month. She was standing in the dining room staring at the wall like she was listening to something. When I woke her, she said someone was calling her name. Chen read the final entry, dated December 10th, just 5 days before the family's disappearance. December 10th. Robert found something in the basement today. He won't tell me what, but he's been acting strange ever since. Says we need to protect the family legacy, and that some secrets are meant to stay hidden. I don't understand what he means, but I'm scared. The children have been having nightmares every night, and I swear I can hear whispering in the walls. The journal ended abruptly, leaving Chen with more questions than answers. Whatever Robert Wells had discovered in the basement had clearly disturbed him enough to change his entire demeanor in the final days before the disappearance. "Martinez," Chen called to the veteran officer, "we need to search the basement thoroughly." According to this journal, Robert Wells found something down there that might explain everything. The basement of the Blackwood mansion was a labyrinth of stone corridors and storage chambers that reflected the Victorian era's approach to underground spaces. Detective Chen descended the narrow wooden stairs with Alex Thompson and Officer Martinez, their flashlights cutting through the musty darkness that had remained undisturbed for 15 years. The basement extended far beyond what the mansion's exterior footprint would suggest, with additional rooms carved directly into the bedrock beneath the property. Chen remembered exploring this space during the original investigation, but they had focused primarily on obvious hiding places and signs of forced entry. Now, armed with Catherine Wells's journal entries, she was looking for something specific that Robert might have discovered. The original investigation report mentioned that Robert had set up a makeshift office down here, Chen said, directing her flashlight toward the far end of the main corridor. He told neighbors he was researching the property's history and genealogy. They found the office in a small chamber that had once served as a wine cellar. A folding table and chair remained where Robert had left them, covered in dust but otherwise undisturbed. Boxes of documents were stacked against the stone walls, and a corkboard hung above the table with what appeared to be a family tree sketched in Robert's careful handwriting. Alex examined the genealogy chart while Chen searched through the document. Boxes. "This is incredibly detailed," he observed. Robert traced his family connection back several generations. Looks like he was related to Harrison Blackwood through his grandmother's line. Chen found the first significant clue in a box labeled Blackwood Family Records. Among the deeds, wills, and business correspondence was a leather-bound ledger that appeared to be Harrison Blackwood's personal journal from the 1890s. Several pages had been marked with sticky notes in Robert's handwriting. The marked passages painted a disturbing picture of Harrison Blackwood's final years. The textile magnate had become increasingly paranoid and reclusive, convinced that business rivals were trying to steal his fortune and destroy his family. But it was the entry dated October 31st, 1898, that made Chen's blood run cold. The children grow restless in their sanctuary. Mary insists we must let them go, but she doesn't understand the danger that awaits them in the world above. The basement chambers will keep them safe until the threats pass. They have everything they need, and the servants know to maintain their silence. Martinez peered over Chen's shoulder as she read. That sounds like he was keeping children in the basement against their will. Chen turned the page, finding more troubling entries that suggested Harrison had been mentally unstable during the mansion's final years of family occupation. References to protecting the innocent and necessary sacrifices appeared throughout. The journal, along with detailed descriptions of modifications he had made to the basement structure. "Look at this," Alex called from across the room. He had found a blueprint rolled up behind one of the storage boxes. This shows the original basement layout, but someone has drawn in additional rooms and passages that aren't on the architectural plans. The modified blueprint revealed a complex network of hidden chambers and tunnels that extended beneath the mansion's foundation. Several rooms were marked with cryptic notations in Harrison's handwriting. Children's quarters, provisioning, chamber, and most disturbing, final sanctuary. Chen studied the blueprint carefully, comparing it to her mental map of the basement they had just explored. According to this, there are at least 3 rooms we haven't found yet. They're accessed through concealed entrances. As if responding to her observation, Alex noticed something unusual about the stone wall behind Robert's makeshift desk. "Detective, this wall looks different from the others. The mortar between these stones is newer, maybe added within the last few decades." Chen examined the wall more closely, running her hands along the joints between the stones. Near the floor, she found what they were looking for, a section of wall that moved slightly when pressed. The hidden mechanism was ingeniously simple, requiring pressure on 2 specific stones simultaneously to activate. With a grinding sound that echoed through the chamber, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark passage that led deeper into the bedrock beneath the mansion. The air that rushed out carried a stale, heavy odor that spoke of spaces long sealed and secrets carefully preserved. Chen aimed her flashlight into the passage, illuminating rough-hewn stone walls that curved away into darkness. "This is what Robert found," she said quietly. "Whatever's down there, it was important enough to make him change completely in those final days." As they prepared to enter the hidden passage, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to discover something that would explain not only the Wells family's disappearance, but potentially decades of unexplained events at the Blackwood mansion. The hidden passage led deeper into the earth than any of them had expected, descending through rough carved stone steps that seemed to follow the natural contours of the bedrock. Detective Chen led the way, her flashlight beam dancing across walls that showed evidence of both 19th-century craftsmanship and more recent modifications. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a musty odor that spoke of decades of sealed isolation. After descending approximately 30 feet, the passage opened into a circular chamber that took Chen's breath away. The room was larger than any space they had explored in the mansion above, its domed ceiling supported by carved stone pillars that demonstrated remarkable engineering skill for the Victorian era. But it was the chamber's contents that made her hand instinctively move toward her service weapon. The space had been furnished as a living area, complete with beds, tables, and storage cabinets that appeared to date from different time periods. Some furniture was clearly Victorian, matching the mansion's original construction era, while other pieces looked much more recent. Modern camping equipment was scattered throughout the room, including battery-powered lanterns, sleeping bags, and provisions that suggested recent habitation. "Someone's been living down here," Martinez observed, his voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. And recently, Alex examined one of the sleeping bags, finding it still held the faint warmth of recent use. Detective, these provisions are fresh. Some of this food has expiration dates from last month. Chen's training kicked in as she realized they might not be alone in the underground complex. She drew her weapon and signaled for the others to stay behind her as she explored the chamber systematically. The space was divided into several distinct areas: sleeping quarters, a food preparation area, and what appeared to be a primitive bathroom facility with a hand-pumped well. Most disturbing were the walls themselves, which were covered with photographs, documents, and handwritten notes that created a comprehensive timeline of the mansion's history. Chen recognized some of the photos from the Wells family's personal collection, but others dated back decades, showing previous residents and families who had lived in the mansion over the years. A large corkboard dominated one wall, displaying what appeared to be a genealogical chart far more complex than anything Robert Wells had created in his makeshift office above. Names and dates connected dozens of families spanning more than a century, with special attention paid to children, and their ages when they had lived in the mansion. "Look at this," Alex called from across the room. He had discovered a journal much newer than Harrison Blackwood's historical records. The handwriting was different from any they had seen before, neat and methodical, with entries dating back several years. Chen took the journal, recognizing immediately that this was the key to understanding everything that had happened. The entries were signed with only initials, E.H., and began in 2005, 3 years before the Wells family had moved to the mansion. January 15, 2005. The Matthews family has departed, as they all eventually do. The children were becoming too aware, asking too many questions about the sounds in the walls. Better that they leave before discovering the truth. March 8, 2005. New family scheduled to arrive in the spring. The Hendersons have 2 children ages 8 and 11, perfect ages for the transition if it becomes necessary. Chen felt a chill as she realized the journal's author had been monitoring and potentially manipulating families who lived in the mansion for years. The entries detailed intimate knowledge of each family's routines, the children's behaviors, and most disturbing, assessments of which children would be suitable for preservation. The journal's tone shifted dramatically when it began discussing the Wells family in 2008. The author wrote with unusual excitement about Robert's genealogical research and his discovery of the basement chambers. But there was also concern about Robert's reaction to what he had found. December 12, 2008. Robert has seen too much. His discovery of the preservation chamber has triggered the same response as Harrison experienced in 1898. He understands the necessity but struggles with the moral implications. Catherine remains unaware, but the children have begun to sense the calling. December 14, 2008. The time has come. Robert has agreed to the necessity. The children are ready for preservation, and Catherine will understand in time. The family legacy must be protected, and the bloodline preserved for future generations. Chen looked up from the journal, her mind racing to process the implications of what she had read. "Martinez, we need backup down here immediately, and contact the state forensics team. We're dealing with something far more complex than a simple missing persons case." As she spoke, a sound echoed from deeper within the underground complex, the unmistakable creak of a door opening somewhere in the darkness beyond the chamber. They were not alone in Harrison Blackwood's underground sanctuary, and whoever else was down there had just become aware of their presence. The sound of footsteps echoed through the stone corridors, deliberate and unhurried, as if whoever was approaching had no fear of discovery. Detective Chen motioned for Alex and Martinez to take cover behind the Victorian furniture while she positioned herself near the chamber's main entrance, her weapon drawn and ready. "Connecticut State Police," Chen called out, her voice carrying through the underground complex. "Identify yourself and come forward with your hands visible." The footsteps stopped, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then, from the darkness beyond the chamber, came a voice that made Chen's blood run cold. It was elderly, refined, and completely calm despite the circumstances. "Detective Chen, I believe. I've been expecting you for quite some time." An elderly woman emerged from the shadows, moving with surprising grace for someone who appeared to be in her 80s. She wore a simple gray dress and carried herself with the dignity of someone accustomed to being in control of her environment. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her sharp blue eyes showed no fear, despite facing an armed police officer. Chen kept her weapon trained on the woman while trying to process what she was seeing. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them and identify yourself." The woman smiled slightly, folding her hands in front of her. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell, Detective. I believe you know me as the Wells family's former neighbor." The revelation hit Chen like a physical blow. Eleanor Hartwell, the sweet elderly woman who had been interviewed multiple times during the original investigation, who had expressed such concern for the missing family, had been living in the underground chambers beneath the mansion. "Mrs. Hartwell, you need to explain what you're doing down here," Chen said, maintaining her professional composure despite the shock of recognition. Eleanor moved slowly to one of the Victorian chairs, settling herself with the careful movements of advanced age. "I've been the guardian of this place for longer than you might imagine, Detective. Someone needs to preserve the family legacy, to ensure that the bloodline continues properly." She gestured around the chamber with obvious pride. Harrison Blackwood understood the necessity of preservation. When the world above becomes too dangerous, too corrupted, we must protect the innocent below. I've simply continued his work. Alex emerged from behind the furniture, his face pale with understanding. "You're E.H. You wrote that journal. You've been monitoring families, manipulating them." Eleanor's expression remained serene. "I prefer to think of it as careful stewardship. Not every family is suitable for preservation, you understand. But when the right bloodline arrives, when children show the proper potential, we must act to protect them." Chen felt sick as the full scope of Eleanor's activities became clear. "Where is the Wells family, Mrs. Hartwell? What did you do to them?" "They're safe," Eleanor replied simply. "Robert understood eventually. The genealogical research showed his children carried the Blackwood bloodline. Such precious genetics couldn't be allowed to disappear into the chaos of the modern world." Martinez, who had been quietly radioing for backup, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to show us where the family is located." Eleanor rose from her chair with the same graceful movements, but there was something different in her expression now, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Officer Martinez. Some secrets are meant to remain hidden, and some preservations are permanent." As she spoke, Chen heard the mechanical sound of locks engaging throughout the underground complex. Eleanor had triggered some kind of security system, sealing them inside the chamber. "You see, Detective," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on an almost maternal tone, "you've discovered too much. But don't worry, there's plenty of room down here for everyone. The preservation chamber can accommodate additional guests when necessary." Chen realized with growing horror that they had walked into a trap, and Eleanor Hartwell was far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. Detective Chen assessed their situation quickly, noting the multiple exit points that Eleanor's security system had sealed. The mechanical locks had engaged with a finality that suggested they were dealing with sophisticated engineering, not simple Victorian-era mechanisms. Eleanor had obviously spent decades preparing for this moment. "Mrs. Hartwell, you need to understand that backup is already en route," Chen said, keeping her weapon steady while trying to maintain some kind of dialogue. "The state police know our location. Trapping us down here will only make things worse for everyone involved." Eleanor smiled with the patience of someone who had anticipated every possible scenario. "Oh, my dear, I'm quite certain your backup will find nothing but an empty mansion. The entrance mechanisms are designed to be invisible when activated. Harrison was remarkably thorough in his engineering. She moved toward what appeared to be a control panel hidden behind a false section of stone wall. Chen could see elaborate mechanical switches and levers that controlled various aspects of the underground complex. You see, Detective, this sanctuary has operated successfully for over a century. Families come and go, but the truly precious ones remain below, safely preserved from the corruption of the modern world. Alex backed toward one of the chamber's other exits, testing the sealed doors. How many families have you done this to, Eleanor? How many children have you taken? Taken? Eleanor's voice showed genuine offense. I prefer to think of it as salvation. The Blackwood bloodline produces exceptional children, but only under proper conditions. The chaos above ground dilutes their potential. She gestured toward a section of the chamber that Chen hadn't fully explored. Robert Wells understood this when he discovered Harrison's preservation journals. The genetic research was quite clear. His children carried markers that made them ideal candidates for continuation. Chen felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications. Continuation of what? The family line, of course. Harrison began the work in the 1890s, but his vision was incomplete. He understood preservation, but not propagation. I've spent decades refining his methods. Eleanor activated another mechanism, and a section of the chamber wall slid away, revealing a corridor that led deeper into the complex. From the darkness beyond came sounds that made Chen's blood run cold. The faint echo of voices, young voices, speaking in the distance. They're alive, Chen whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Of course they're alive, Eleanor replied, as if the question was absurd. Emma and Jake are thriving in their new environment. They've adapted remarkably well to underground life. Children are so resilient when properly guided. Martinez had been working quietly at one of the sealed exits, trying to find any weakness in the locking mechanism. Detective, he called softly, I think I found something. This lock has a manual override, but it's going to take time. Eleanor noticed the officer's activity but seemed unconcerned. Officer Martinez, I wouldn't recommend that course of action. The manual overrides trigger additional security measures that are far less pleasant than simple containment. Chen kept her weapon trained on Eleanor while her mind raced through options. What happened to Robert and Catherine? Eleanor's expression softened slightly, showing what might have been genuine regret. Adults are more difficult to preserve properly. Robert's discovery of the chambers created an unfortunate situation. He became obsessed with protecting his children, but his methods were crude. Catherine was never suitable for preservation, too attached to the surface world, too resistant to the necessary changes. The implication was clear, and Chen felt anger rising in her chest. You killed them. I preserved what could be preserved, and eliminated what threatened the continuation, Eleanor replied with clinical detachment. The children's safety required difficult choices. From the corridor beyond the opened wall came the sound of footsteps, young footsteps, approaching. Slowly, Chen realized that Emma and Jake Wells were about to emerge from whatever nightmare they had been living for the past 15 years, and she was about to see the full extent of Eleanor Hartwell's twisted interpretation of preservation. The footsteps grew closer, and Chen's heart pounded as she prepared to see Emma and Jake Wells for the first time in 15 years. When they emerged from the corridor, the sight that greeted her was both a relief and a horror that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Emma and Jake were indeed alive, but they bore no resemblance to the children who had vanished in 2008. Emma, now 27, moved with the mechanical precision of someone whose life had been completely controlled for over a decade. Her dark hair hung past her shoulders, and her pale skin suggested years without natural sunlight. Jake, 23, walked beside his sister with the same eerie composure, his eyes holding an emptiness that spoke of psychological conditioning beyond anything Chen had encountered. Both siblings were dressed in simple, clean clothing that looked handmade, and they regarded the intruders in their underground world with curiosity rather than fear or recognition of rescue. "Emma, Jake," Eleanor said warmly, as if introducing old friends. "We have visitors today. This is Detective Chen. She's been looking for you for quite some time." Emma tilted her head slightly, studying Chen with detached interest. "Are you here for preservation too?" she asked, her voice soft, but completely devoid of emotion. Chen felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized the full extent of the psychological damage Eleanor had inflicted. "Emma, I'm here to take you home. Do you remember your parents, Robert and Catherine Wells?" Jake stepped forward, his expression puzzled. "Our parents couldn't be preserved," he said matter-of-factly. Eleanor explained that they weren't suitable for continuation. "But we carry the important genetics." The clinical way the young man spoke about his parents' fate made Chen's stomach turn. Eleanor had spent 15 years conditioning these children to accept their captivity as normal, even necessary. "Children," Eleanor said gently, "Detective Chen doesn't understand our work here. She comes from the chaotic world above, where bloodlines are diluted and children are exposed to corruption. You can see how it's affected her thinking." Alex, who had been silent during this exchange, finally found his voice. "Emma, Jake, I'm going to help you get out of here. You don't have to stay in this place anymore." Emma and Jake exchanged glances, and for a moment Chen saw something flicker in their eyes. Not quite recognition, but perhaps the first stirring of doubt about the world Eleanor had created for them. "But the preservation work," Emma said uncertainly. "We have responsibilities to the bloodline." Eleanor's expression hardened as she sensed the possibility of losing control. "The children understand their importance to genetic continuation. They've been carefully prepared for their roles in preserving the Blackwood legacy." Chen realized with horror that Eleanor's idea of preservation included more than simple captivity. The clinical language about bloodlines and genetic continuation suggested a breeding program designed to perpetuate whatever twisted vision Harrison Blackwood had conceived over a century ago. "Martinez," Chen called without taking her eyes off Eleanor. "How's that override coming?" "Almost there," Martinez replied, sweat beading on his forehead as he worked at the mechanism. "But we need to move fast once I get it open." Eleanor reached for another control on her panel, and Chen saw her opportunity. "Emma, Jake, look at me," she said urgently. "Your real names are Emma and Jake Wells. You had a dog named Buster. Emma, you loved butterfly stickers. Jake, your favorite toy was a blue elephant." For the first time since they had appeared, both young adults showed genuine emotion. Jake's hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, and Chen saw him touch something. Small, perhaps a remnant of the stuffed elephant he had cherished as a child. "I remember," Jake whispered, and the spell Eleanor had woven around them began to crack. The moment Jake whispered those two words, Eleanor's carefully constructed world began to collapse. She lunged for the control panel, but Chen was faster, tackling the elderly woman before she could activate whatever final security measures she had planned. They struggled briefly before Chen managed to restrain Eleanor, whose surprising strength spoke to decades of physical labor in the underground complex. "Martinez, now!" Chen shouted as she secured Eleanor with handcuffs. The manual override clicked open with a grinding sound of ancient mechanisms, and cool air from the basement above rushed into the chamber. The sound of the opening doors seemed to break whatever remaining hold Eleanor's conditioning had on Emma and Jake. Jake pulled a small, worn stuffed elephant from his pocket, tears streaming down his face as 15 years of suppressed memories came flooding back. "Buster," he said, clutching the toy to his chest. "I had a dog named Buster, and this was my elephant, Mr. Peanuts." Emma moved toward her brother, her own emotional walls crumbling as she began to remember fragments of their life before the underground nightmare. "We lived in a big house with a blue car in the driveway. Mom made pancakes on Sunday mornings. Chen felt overwhelmed with relief as she watched the siblings slowly reconnect with their true identities. That's right. Your mother was Catherine, and your father was Robert. They loved you both very much. Eleanor, now restrained, but still defiant, looked at the emotional reunion with disgust. You're destroying everything, she spat. 15 years of careful preservation, of genetic protection, ruined by your ignorance. Alex approached Emma and Jake cautiously, not wanting to overwhelm them with too much stimulus after their isolation. There's a whole world waiting for you up there. People who have been looking for you, who never gave up hope. As Martinez helped guide the group toward the exit, Chen took one last look around the chamber that had served as a prison for 15 years. She thought about Robert and Catherine Wells, whose only crime had been inheriting a house with a dark secret, and whose love for their children had ultimately cost them their lives. "Detective?" Jake said quietly as they climbed the stone steps toward the basement. "What happened to our parents? I remember Eleanor saying they couldn't be preserved." Chen exchanged a glance with Martinez, knowing this was a conversation that would require careful handling and professional counseling support. "We'll talk about everything once we get you both to safety and medical care. Right now, the important thing is that you're alive and you're going to be okay." The climb to the mansion's basement felt like ascending from hell itself. When they finally emerged into the natural light filtering through the basement windows, both Emma and Jake shielded their eyes, having spent 15 years in artificial illumination. Outside, the crime scene team and backup officers that Martinez had called were waiting anxiously. Paramedics immediately began assessing Emma and Jake for medical issues, while Chen briefed the team leader on what they had discovered in the underground complex. Eleanor Hartwell was transported under heavy guard, her decades-long reign of terror finally at an end. As the ambulance carrying Emma and Jake disappeared down the long driveway, Chen stood in front of the Blackwood mansion and tried to process everything that had happened. The house that had been a symbol of mystery and loss for 15 years had finally revealed its secrets, but the cost had been enormous. 2 parents were dead. 2 children had lost their entire young adult lives, and a community's faith in the safety of their neighbors had been shattered. Yet there was also hope. Emma and Jake Wells were alive, and with proper care and support, they might be able to reclaim some semblance of normal life. Their nightmare was over, even if the healing would take years to complete. 6 months after the discovery in the Blackwood mansion, Detective Lisa Chen sat in the witness chair of the Connecticut Superior Court, providing testimony in the case of the state of Connecticut versus Eleanor Hartwell. The courtroom was packed with reporters, local residents, and family members of other victims whose cases had been reopened following Eleanor's arrest. Eleanor, now 88 and facing multiple charges including kidnapping, murder, and child endangerment, sat at the defendant's table with the same serene expression she had worn in the underground chamber. Even facing life imprisonment, she maintained her belief that she had been protecting rather than harming the children in her care. The investigation that followed the mansion discovery had revealed the true scope of Eleanor's crimes. Forensic teams working in the underground complex had uncovered evidence of at least 7 other families who had disappeared from the Millbrook area over the past 4 decades. Not all had been preserved as successfully as Emma and Jake Wells. Emma and Jake themselves were slowly rebuilding their lives with the help of specialized therapists who worked with long-term captivity survivors. The transition to modern life had been overwhelming at first, but both siblings showed remarkable resilience. Emma had expressed interest in studying psychology, hoping to help other survivors of trauma, while Jake was working with art therapists to process his experiences through painting and sculpture. They had chosen not to attend Eleanor's trial, focusing instead on their healing process. Chen respected that decision, understanding that facing their captor in court might re-traumatize them when they were finally making progress. Alex Thompson had completed the mansion renovation, but the new owners had decided to donate the property to the state as a memorial to Eleanor's victims. The underground chambers had been sealed permanently, and the mansion itself would become a center for missing children advocacy and support services. The genealogical research that had originally attracted Robert Wells to the property revealed a connection that Eleanor had twisted into her justification for preservation. Robert had indeed been related to Harrison Blackwood, but the connection was distant and legally meaningless. Eleanor had used this tenuous link to rationalize her actions, creating an elaborate fantasy about bloodline preservation that masked her true motivation: a pathological need to control and possess children. During her testimony, Chen reflected on how the case had changed her understanding of evil. Eleanor Hartwell had appeared to be a kindly elderly neighbor, the type of person every community trusted and relied upon. Her facade had been so complete that she had been interviewed multiple times during the original investigation without raising any suspicion. Detective Chen, the prosecutor asked, "In your professional opinion, could this tragedy have been prevented?" Chen considered the question carefully. Eleanor Hartwell spent decades perfecting her methods and her camouflage. She understood how to exploit community trust and family vulnerability. However, this case has taught us the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and following every lead, no matter how unlikely it might seem. The trial concluded with Eleanor receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. As Chen watched the elderly woman being led away in shackles, she felt no satisfaction, only a profound sadness for all the lives that had been destroyed by one person's twisted interpretation of love and protection. In the months that followed, Chen received regular updates on Emma and Jake's progress. Both siblings had chosen to take new last names, symbolically reclaiming their identities from the woman who had stolen their childhood. They stayed in touch with Chen, crediting her with giving them back their lives. The Blackwood Mansion case had become a defining moment in Chen's career, reminding her why she had become a police officer in the first place. Sometimes the monsters wore familiar faces and lived next door, but justice could still prevail when dedicated people refused to give up on the victims. Emma and Jake Wells had finally come home, 15 years late, but alive. And that was a victory, worth celebrating even amid the tragedy of everything they had lost.